So when Jim English and I began to think about a year dedicated to the theme of adaptations, we naturally found ourselves gravitating towards a series of what we might call classic questions of adaptation in the arts and letters. How do works migrate from one medium to another? How does one genre beg, borrow, or steal from another or from others? How do forms get transposed and transformed as they move through the various domains of culture? We also thought, as students of history and culture, of the complex ways in which individuals and groups adapt as they move in space and time, confront new challenges, shifts in environment, or encounter others. In the course of this year's lecture series, we'll certainly be hearing quite a lot about these various matters. Yet, Jim English and I felt we would miss the complexity of the theme of adaptations, as well as some of the biggest questions of all, if we did not also create opportunities to think about the problem of adaptation in the boundary between culture and nature. It is appropriate that we begin this year's lecture series with the theme of language, for there is no other phenomenon that is more relevant to that boundary than language itself. The philosopher Ernst Cassirer in the 1940s spoke of man as homo symbolicus, identifying the ability to fashion and communicate through symbols as the defining characteristic of our species. Cassirer readily followed many centuries of Western thought in placing this ability firmly on the side of culture, the side of that which separates us from nature. However, well before Cassirer, and indeed even before Charles Darwin, thinkers had begun to consider the possibility that language is a product of nature. These days, neither side of this divide seems to offer a final answer to this most vexing question of human capacities. We're fortunate to have Professor Terrence Deacon here today to illuminate us on these matters. In a career spanning roughly 3 decades, Professor Deacon has articulated an important and highly innovative, and I quote him, reappraisal of human brain and language evolution that emphasizes, and again I quote him, the unbroken continuity between human and non-human brains, and yet at the same time describes a singular discontinuity between human and non-human minds, or to be more precise, between brains that use this form of communication and brains that do not. With that tension between an unbroken continuity and a singular discontinuity, Professor Deacon has taught us to seek answers not on one side or another of the boundary between nature and culture. Rather, we should look to the complex interactions of the border zone itself, where human cognitive capacities, biology, and environment meet and interact in dynamic and reciprocal ways. In looking at his work, I've been particularly struck by 2 premises. First, that alongside whatever the biological structure of the brain is also some form of self-organizing entity, although I've been told that his most recent work in some ways is rethinking that paradigm. But a self-organizing entity whose creations and activities in certain ways exceed the encodings of the genes. And second, that we need to speak of a coevolution of the brain and language, such that language itself comes to affect the brain's evolution and even the larger environment within which evolution occurs. Terrence Deacon earned his PhD from Harvard University in 1984. After teaching at Harvard and earning tenure at Harvard, he went on to Boston University, the McLean Hospital, and the Harvard Medical School. He then moved to California in 2002, where he is professor of biology and neuroscience at the University of California, Berkeley. Alongside many published papers, Professor Deacon is the author of The Symbolic Species, The Coevolution of Language in the Brain, published by W.W. Norton in 1997, and widely acclaimed as a seminal work on the origin of language. A new book is about to appear, again published by Norton, titled Incomplete Nature, How Mind Emerged from Matter. I found myself thinking of the age-old claim that nature abhors a vacuum. And with that in mind, I thought that the book's title, Incomplete Nature, is a wonderfully counterintuitive starting point in ontological gaps and incompleteness of nature itself. thinking about today's lecture, it is in some ways equally counterintuitive and perhaps provocative that we begin a year of discussion of adaptations with a lecture bearing the title, The Non-Adaptive Origins of Language. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, and what a remarkable audience. I'm glad you all came out. Thank you very much. I hope to challenge you, make you think new thoughts, and send you away talking to yourself all evening. So let's hope that it works out. And part of my mission here is, of course, to expand the debate, to expand the discussion, but also to provide what may be insights that will cross over these domains. I'm a trained bench neuroscientist on the one hand, but I'm terribly interested in the philosophy of language, in the philosophy of mind, and in the humanities. And I think that the two need to be brought together more explicitly. And I hope tonight I can at least start with that process. Let me begin by just recapitulating what you heard a few minutes ago with a fairly simple analogy. And the argument is fairly straightforward. That is, I want to argue that once language-like behavior became critical to hominid life, it effectively became an artificial niche to which hominid brains had to adapt. And the analogy I make here is to beaver dams. Beavers have had to adapt to the aquatic niche that beavers created. That is, over the course of evolutionary time, beavers have changed their environment in such a way that they've had to adapt to the environment that they've created. This is a process that's come to be called niche construction since actually after my work, but I think the term is the right term. They've constructed the niche that they evolve in, and of course they evolve with respect to that niche. And so, in a very real respect, what I'm going to argue is that we have evolved with respect to a niche as well, an artificial niche that we've created a bit like beavers. Beavers have become more aquatic because of what they've done to their world. We have become more symbolic, and I mean that in a biological sense, because of the world that we've created. Our world, our beaver dam is culture, and it has shaped us over time. And so what I want to talk about today is exactly what kind of shaping that process has taken. And what I want to say is that although we oftentimes think of it as merely a cognitive change, what I want to claim is that, of course, it's not. This is one of my favorite book covers. It's from a book published in Berkeley, of course, called Why Cats Paint, A Theory of Feline Aesthetics. Now, the issue you're probably asking yourself is, how is this cat's feet tied down? And that's because we don't find a lot of feline aesthetics, although they end their book with this wonderful section on feline sculptures done in soft furniture. You may have some of this at home. So part of my question is not just about our cognition, but about how I think our entire mind, in many ways, is unlike what we see in the rest of the world, and for very interesting and surprising reasons. And the problem I want to begin with, of course, goes all the way back to one of our heroes, or my heroes at least, Charles Darwin. But I want to pick on a peculiar aspect of Charles Darwin's problem. Because shortly after writing and publishing The Origin of Species, he writes to a friend in the United States, Asa Gray, in a letter, and he says, the sight of a peacock's tail, of a feather in a peacock's tail, whenever I gaze at it, makes me feel sick. Now, why does he say this? The reason that he says this is that his theory of natural selection had a tough time explaining this kind of what I call extravagant complexity that we find in nature. Complexity that looks like it's not doing a lot of good. And in fact, the problem with the peacock's tail is it makes male peacocks much more easy prey for predators. And they die at a high rate during the mating seasons and so on, when they're out there making lots of noise and shaking their feathers around. Darwin had an answer to this, and his answer was what he called sexual selection. He much of the second book he wrote, that we mostly know by its first half title, The Descent of Man, was mostly written about sexual selection. And that's because he argued that sexual selection was what drove the complexity of humans, what drove language, for example. And sexual selection occurs when organisms are vying with members of the same species and the same sex for access to reproductive capacities, typically offered by the opposite sex or by something that the opposite sex has produced. And in this capacity, we see organisms competing with each other, battling with each other, developing weapons like horns and spurs and so on to attack each other with. And these are extravagant, and the peacock's tail is an extravagance that he felt could be explained this way. And today, in fact, we also think it's explained this way. He also argued that language was like this as well, and he has a theory of language that begins effectively like song, in which it's a kind of mating communication. And he felt that this might be able to explain the complexity of this capacity that we have. And of course, we know of many species that use song in this way, and in fact, many birds do, and probably humpback whales and other species. The co-discoverer of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, however, had a problem with this idea. He had a problem with it on two counts. First of all, he felt that natural selection could only have endowed the savage with a brain a little superior to that of an ape. The reason for this can be captured in a kind of joke that may be familiar with many of you. It's a joke about two campers coming out in the morning and starting to cook their breakfast, and suddenly a grizzly bear comes running after them. And the one camper turns to the other and he says, "Oh my God, we can't outrun a grizzly bear, he's going to kill us." And the other camper looks at him and he says, "Yes, but I can outrun you." That's natural selection. Natural selection does not produce the best, most extravagant result, only that result which is better than all the competition. And so if all the competition does not have to produce this extravagance, it shouldn't produce this kind of extravagant result. An additional problem was that Wallace didn't like the concept of sexual selection. He felt that it actually damaged the theory, that it would brought into the... excuse me. I think that was my phone doing that. Excuse me. What it brought in was a kind of conscious aesthetic into the story of evolution. And he felt that this is exactly what Darwin should have avoided. That thinking about, the beauty of a display and so on should be bad news and leave it out. Unfortunately, he turned to something much more troublesome, and that is spiritual conceptions of evolution, in which he argued that, in effect, some kind of unearthly force was involved in the production of human consciousness in human minds and human language. And, of course, this became a famous destruction of the theory. In one sense, he was responsible in two ways for a problem for the theory of natural selection. Number one, his denial of sexual selection caused the sexual selection theory to be ignored until about the early 1970s. For nearly a century, it went underground, so to speak. Second of all, his production of an argument about something like intelligent design has haunted the field, of course, ever since. The problem, however, with Darwin's theory is pretty serious as well, because Darwin's theory suggests, unfortunately, that if it's sexual selection that drives things, then men and women should be as different as male and female peacocks. Sexual selection produces radical differences in the sexes, complementary effects in the sexes. And, of course, language and human cognition are quite similar across the sexes, something you wouldn't expect if sexual selection was the driver. The problem is made even more difficult when we actually look at how language is produced in the brain. And we've learned a lot in the last few decades, using especially in vivo techniques for looking at metabolism in the human brain. And here I just sort of lay out a bunch of colored spots and identify areas that are involved. These are areas that are active in some of these various language tasks. And the point I want to make here is that we have now learned that language occupies a lot of the brain to do different tasks. We're not just using a few specialized language areas, but in fact, much of the cerebral hemispheres are involved. The troublesome feature is that not only are these different than the kinds of areas in the brain that are involved in producing innate calls like laughter and sobbing, but in fact, they utilize structures that are not new. All the structures in the human brain that are involved in language, and one way or another, have what we call homologs in other species of primates. That is, they were there already. They've become modified to do what language does. But they are not new, not something plugged in like a new chip that makes this possible. So the real question is, how could such a complex and synergistic function like this, that recruits all of these different structures that evolved to do something differently in the past, how could they have come together to do language? And how could evolution have produced a brain that not only does it by this sort of hodgepodge pulling things together, but does so elegantly and powerfully, as it does for us? And that's the question I want to address. A second question associated with this has to do with the fact that, unlike a lot of complex behaviors in the world, our language capacity is radically dependent upon social transmission. Vast amounts of information are being transmitted from person to person, from generation to generation. Yes, there are, without question, biological predispositions behind it. But in fact, a vast amount of information is being passed generation to generation. It's in effect been offloaded, a sort of behavioral capacity that's been taken out of the genome and laid upon social transmission. And here's a quote from Darwin talking about what he says: the struggle for life is constantly going on amongst the words and grammatical forms in language. In other words, he even recognized, as we do today, that languages themselves evolve and change over time. So, in effect, language is a peculiar kind of adaptation. And one of the reasons it has been a challenge since Darwin's time is that we've had a lot of difficulty putting all of these very counterintuitive facts together. Well, I'm going to take a very different approach today. In my book, The Symbolic Species, I talk a lot about the adaptations responsible for language. What I'm going to do today is to talk to some extent about the non-adaptive components behind it before I get back to the adaptation side of the story. So, the first example I'm going to use is very different than language, but it will give you an analogy that I want you to take with you, because it's a very familiar story. This is about this monkey eating fruit. The story here is that we need to eat fruit because we need vitamin C or we get quite sick. In fact, when Magellan sailed around the world, somewhere over half of his crew died from some complications of scurvy. It was only the discovery that vitamin C could be carried on these long voyages that kept people alive under these circumstances. We need this stuff. It's deadly to not have it. And in fact, this is true for all the monkeys and apes. And I show in this, see if I can get this to come up. It's not going to pop up here. So I'll just walk over and point. The red sections over there on this tree diagram are from those lineages, NWM, New World monkeys, OWM, Old World monkeys, and chimpanzees and humans and other apes up there. We all need to eat vitamin C, and all of those red lines represent lineages that need to eat vitamin C to be healthy. The green lines represent other lineages. In fact, almost all other lineages of animals don't need to eat it because they make their own. They synthesize their own vitamin C. So you don't have to give your dogs and cats fruit for them to be happy. Interestingly enough, in 1994, a group of Japanese researchers went to rats, and they went into the rat genome, and they found the gene that produces the protein that does the last step in synthesizing vitamin C in rats who can make their own. They identified the gene. They got the sequence of it. It's got this funny sort of name. I won't try to even pronounce it here. I'll get it wrong almost certainly. They used it as a probe to look for a similar gene in other species. And the one they looked at first was you and I, humans. And what they found was that, in fact, there is a corresponding gene in you and I. It's just full of noise. It doesn't work. In fact, it's had what we call a frame shift mutation, so that it produces nonsense and eventually shuts itself off. This gene turns out to be in all the monkeys and apes. We have all inherited it from an ancestor that did produce its own vitamin C. We just stopped doing it. Stopped doing it about 35 million years ago. Well, the question is, why should we have an inactive gene for doing what we need so much? Why didn't we maintain it? The answer is that, in fact, it's because we didn't need it at a certain point. We didn't need it absolutely. Our ancestors, over here on the far left, who were not yet eating much fruits, but were mostly eating insects before about 35 million years ago, had to produce their own vitamin C, like most other self-respecting mammals do. However, at about 35 million years ago, we know from looking at the fossil record, these animals began foraging in daylight. We know this because their eyes became smaller, but also their teeth changed, so as not so much to be specialized for insect eating, but for fruit eating. They were hanging out in the trees anyway, and they could go after the fruit that had evolved in angiosperms to be available for pollination and distribution by birds for the most part. These seeds were dispersed by this wonderful disperser that flies long distances and can carry seeds around. And the way these plants did it is they produced an edible container for the seeds that would stay edible for a long period of time because it had this wonderful antioxidant, ascorbic acid, vitamin C in it. Maintains its freshness for a period of time, long enough for the birds to eat it and carry the seeds away. Primates started eating this at about 35 million years ago, our ancestors. And at that point, what happened is that if a mutation indicated here in the middle down at the bottom damaged the gene a little bit, made it a little less functional, you could still make it because you were eating fruit. And if you kept eating fruit at a regular basis, every few days you got enough to go on, just like for us, then in effect, over time, you could pass on this damaged gene, and your offspring, if they were still eating fruit along with you, would do fine as well. However, over a long period of time, as noise begins to accumulate, eventually the damage is such that you can't go back. You can't recover this gene, and that's what's happened in our lineage. And again, not just us, but all monkeys and apes. At this point, we are effectively now addicted to vitamin C from our diet. We can't do without it. In a sense, because we were able to get it independent of our genes, what I would describe it as it relaxed natural selection that was maintaining the function of that gene. Allowed it to accumulate mutations, and eventually those mutations produced a non-functional result. However, now once you're addicted, like every good addict, you need to get it regularly, and you'll do whatever you can to get it. In fact, our bodies have changed significantly because of this need. We have a very different digestive system because of it, different teeth because of it. Taste buds are different. We like the taste of sweet and sour. A whole range of things have changed, including blood-borne proteins that carry it around from our digestive system to our organs. And those separate lines I show here from other genes represent this effect. That is, what's happened as the ability to make vitamin C has declined. Other capacities to climb, to eat, to digest, and so on have been exaggerated. Selection has been shifted off of making vitamin C to getting vitamin C. And what that means is where there was one locus in the genome that was doing this work, there now can be dozens, each of them doing just a little bit to make it more likely that vitamin C will come up. In effect, they become now selected for synergistic interactions, how they interact together to produce this missing piece. So this is the kind of model I want you to think of here. And I won't describe down below. This is a simulation we did, but I'm running a bit slow here. So I'll just describe what's at the top. I happen to believe, and there's some wonderful coincidence that suggests this, and that is that our ability as primates to see in 3 colors, I think as a result of this. This is one of those adaptations that makes it ideal for us to find good edible vitamin C. Why? Because fruit advertised itself to birds who were very good at seeing in color all along by virtue of color change. Birds could now pick out that it's suddenly ripe. Now's the time that the plant has set it up for me to eat. Well, primates, interestingly enough, like most of us mammals, evolved from an ancestor that was nocturnal. And as a result, had sacrificed diversity of color receptors in order to have broadly tuned receptors that could pick up light at night. As we move back into daylight, most other mammals did not develop color vision, but we primates did. And the result is that, of course, we can use it to make fine discriminations, not only of fruit and its ripeness, but also of leaves and so on, to identify when they're at an appropriately edible stage. This is an adaptation that I would submit is a way of getting vitamin C, aiding our ability to get vitamin C. The point I'm making here is that, in effect, natural selection has been shifted precisely because it was relaxed, and it shifted things around. I'm going to give you another example now, a little closer to the language story. And this is an example about birdsong. And this is a case in which we're looking at 2 different birds here on the far left. One's a wild and one's a domesticated bird. They're of the same species. It was found somewhere around 250 to 300 years ago and chosen by breeders because it was easy to breed them for color. And they could breed them for interesting color. And this has been going on for about 250 years in Japan. Now, what is interesting about these 2 species, studied by this man down here in the corner, a colleague of mine, Kazuo Okanoya in Tokyo, is that although they're the same species, they sing a very different song. And when he began studying what's called the Bengalese finch on the right there, he studied it because it had a song that seemed to have a kind of syntax to it. It would have units of song that it could swap around in different orders, and different individuals and different families even had different orders of song. However, when he went out into the wild, and partly because of my own urging to find the ancestor of the Bengalese finch, called the white-rumped munia, he found something very surprising. The white-rumped munia has an entirely stereotypic song. And you can see the difference here on the right. On the top, you see the Bengalese finch song with some repeated elements that are juggled around in different positions. Down at the bottom, you can see the white-rumped munia song, in which you can see that this same sequence is repeated almost verbatim, one after the other after the other. There's an additional difference. The Bengalese finch learns its song from listening to other singers. The white-rumped munia will produce its song even in isolation if it's never heard another bird singing. This is a very significant difference, and people studying birds have been interested in this for some time. What we suggest is this, that in fact, in the wild, song is an important attractor for females. It's an important identifier for your species' individuality compared to other birds and so on. But in captivity, if you're being bred by hand, so to speak, because of the color of your feathers and their distribution, song matters little for who gets to breed with whom. And so what we think has happened is that, in fact, and we've begun to do some genetic analysis to find out exactly how this has occurred, is that, in fact, the control of song has begun to degrade in these animals. In other words, like the vitamin C case, something is being provided from the outside. Song is playing no role in who gets to mate with whom, who makes how many babies. The result is, if you can think about song from this bird as made up of a series of what you might call notes, A, B, C, D, E, and F here on the top, in a bird that has a very stereotypic song, the transition between notes, indicated here by these blue arrows, should be highly predictive, so that there's very low probabilities of going from one kind of song to another, but very high from one note to another. When it degrades, however, which note precedes which note and follows which note, is less highly biased. And that means it's much more flexible. Another way to put it is that this is a highly constrained and controlled song. This is one that just simply lost control. They're still singing, but their bias is gone. And that's what we think has basically happened. We have, in fact, done a series of simulations, and we come back to this later on. What we show is that this is a very predictable phenomenon. And we can show that as soon as you relax selection on who mates with whom, song will immediately become more complex. One of the interesting things is that when it does, it also becomes more dependent on learning. And let me now turn to that. On the left, here I talk about, show a picture of the bird brain. Now, bird brains are organized quite a bit different than mammal brains. I won't go into the details. But what we see here on the top is the motor control of song in a typical non-learning singer, like a songbird that you might find in the wild, that doesn't have to hear anybody singing in order to sing. And these are little nuclei that are involved at the top, motor output, at the bottom, the auditory input in. What we do know is they need to at least hear themselves sing, or they won't produce a normal song. So a bird that's been deafened from birth won't produce a normal song. Interestingly enough, if you have to learn your song, something very different is the case. And we see that over here on the right. Many more parts of the brain are involved in learning song if you have to hear it and match it to somebody else's singing. And so what we see is much more of the brain is involved. What we see is in all of the green lines, these are areas, some of them involved in learning, some of them involved in guessing and adjusting how to sing when, context-sensitive areas, and so on. Again, auditory and motor systems, but much more complex. What's interesting is this, that in the white-rump Munia, their song control system looks like those guys on the left. The Bengalese finch, the same species, separated by only 250 years, and not under any selection for singing, has a brain organized for song like this on the right. In other words, in the absence of natural selection on singing, the brain's capacity to control and organize song has become much more complex. Let me now give you what I think is a way to think about this problem. This is a sort of algorithm for how a bird acquires its song in the case of an animal that has an innate song, that doesn't have to learn its song. So we can look at it this way. It comes into life with a couple of biases. It has a motor bias, that it tends to produce certain kinds of vocalizations as opposed to others. So it has a slightly biased way of making sounds. It also has an innate auditory template. We know this, again, because if it's deafened, it won't produce a normal song. But so long as it can hear itself sing, it will begin to produce a normal song. It begins by producing a song that's not quite right. We call it subsong. And subsong, produced just before puberty sets in, gets produced initially. You listen to yourself sing it. You then compare it to your auditory bias. You make some assessment of the difference. You modify the tendency to sing again, and you sing another song. And eventually, by cycling through this series of steps, the bird zeroes in, converges on the song that's typical of its species. Again, it's innate, it's built in, but it's distributed in the brain. It still has to learn, in a sense, how to do it. It's not fully set up like some sort of computer program. But what happens if these biases degrade? What happens is that now subsong will be much more variable initially when it's produced. That is indeed the case with the Bengalese finch. They listen to themselves sing, and they compare it to something in their auditory system. But they have no innate auditory template. What biases are in their auditory system? Well, they're doing this as young adults. They're beginning subsong as young adults. They've heard birds sing for the whole early part of their life. And in fact, as a result, the bias that they hold in their nervous system, in their auditory system, is a bias of what they've heard before. And as a result, they listen to that difference, they alter the way they sing, and they then produce sub-song again, and eventually cycle around to a song that's very similar to songs that they were hearing when they were very young, when they were young chicks. A very different kind of process, but a process that still uses the same logic. It's just that you've degraded the biases that you came in with. But in so doing, now song becomes socially transmitted. And so what's happened under these circumstances is that much more of the structure of a song is picked up by what your experience tells you. Now, what's even more interesting about this is that if you hear two different individuals singing very different songs when you're young, if you're a Bengalese finch, you'll pick up some combination of those songs. So it's much more flexible, much more variable. But now that brings me back to the brain. What's going on here? Well, what's going on, I've sort of caricatured it in this picture. At the top, as you begin this process of domestication, the song template, so to speak, is well established. And it's a highly biasing influence. But as the animal becomes domesticated, and song plays no role in who gets to reproduce and who not, and who produces the most babies and who not, then what happens is the template for song degrades, breaks down. Why? Simply because of noise. Noise is accumulating spontaneously in the genome all the time. But as a result, what this means is that any other system that might begin to bias singing can now begin to play more of a role. If you've gotten rid of a very strong bias, the weaker biases can now begin to play a role in singing. And so what's happened is that areas involved in learning now become more important. Areas involved in flexible motor behavior become more important. And, of course, what you've experienced becomes more important. And all of those things come to song indirectly, by a variety of other means, and have to get juggled around in the brain through lots of different structures and their connections. The brain becomes more complex in its control of song, not because you've selected for complexity, but in fact just the opposite. Because you've relaxed certain biases and allowed other possibilities to play a role. The connections were always there, but they could not play any significant role. Only when the biases, the innate biases, were removed do we find this transition. So what we see is a transition from an innate song that's passed on genetically, as over here on the left, where the genes pass the song on. You have to do a little bit of learning, but it's internal learning, so to speak, listening to yourself sing, learning about your own biases, so to speak. And as a result, everybody sings the same song, and they don't listen to anybody else, or at least it doesn't matter what they hear. What's happened as the genetic song has become degraded, however, is that epigenesis, developmental processes, become more important. Processes that are biased by experience, connections in the brain that get strengthened or weakened because of experience, and, of course, memories that get established. And that means they're learning also, but now the learning is from the social milieu. They're beginning to listen to song being produced by others, and a majority of the song is now being produced not genetically and transmitted, but transmitted socially. Now, it shouldn't surprise you that I'm suggesting that this has something to do with the evolution of language. Because exactly what's happened is that we've moved from a control of vocalization, which here in the top right is controlled almost entirely by emotional systems in the brain, automatic vocalizations, and a very few nuclei that we don't learn. We don't learn how to laugh and sob. We just learn how to suppress them in the right or wrong circumstances. What's happened, however, is we've shifted from this mostly subcortical nuclear-controlled system. By nuclear, I mean nuclei in the brain, nothing scary or anything like that, to a system that's almost entirely cortically controlled. The shift has been radical, so that, in fact, we're not using automatic vocalizations. And guess what? If I found that somehow a sad thought came to mind, it would interrupt my speech. It would alter the way I'm talking. because both systems are still there. They're still working. It's just that, in fact, there's been this superimposition of control from the cerebral cortex. But not just from one area of the forebrain, from sensory and motor areas all over the forebrain that are playing a significant role in the control of language. A number of things that are parallels between the finch and language. One of the things that's happened with the finch is that it no longer only vocalizes when it's sexually aroused or aggressively aroused, but it's vocalizing all the time in various circumstances. And of course, you and I, when we were very young, started just to vocalize spontaneously, not when we were really upset, but in fact, when we are not emotionally aroused at all. We just babble away because making sounds is somehow interesting. We just tend to do it. It's been decoupled, so to speak, from arousal. Similar to the Bengalese finch, what sound we can put after what sound has become decoupled also. When we laugh, the same sound follows the same sound, follows the same sound, follows the same sound. And that's the case with all of our innate vocalizations. What's happened, of course, is we've decoupled that system so that the sounds can now be reorganized and juxtaposed. And of course, we do it by auditory learning. We don't have to learn how to laugh and sob, but we certainly learn how to speak our own languages. The organization of it has been redistributed in the brain to structures that never had to play a role in this before in mammals. The information that controls it is social for the most part. Radical offloading of control onto social transmission. And finally, as I try to demonstrate with my pathetic sobbing through speech, is that we haven't lost those other forms of communication. They are now, in a sense, subordinate to language. They play a role in the background music and emotionality of our speech, and the timing and so on, the prosody of speech. So we have now really two systems, and they're, in some sense, competing with each other, overlapping onto each other. A much more complicated system. And like the Bengalese finch, in another sense, we have lost almost certainly a lot of our innate vocalizations. In chimpanzees, we can typically count somewhere in the range of 20-odd distinct vocalizations with distinct reference. In you and I, you can maybe count them on your hand. Laughter, sobbing, shrieks, groans, starting to run out already. We've probably degraded that system in the process. So, to end this first part, I want to argue that we may well be what I call a self-domesticated or degenerate ape. Now, the issue of calling us degenerate is a little bit misleading, of course, because what I'm saying is this kind of degeneration opens us up to lots of possibilities. It shifts control from the automatic and fixed to the non-automatic and flexible and socially transmitted. Although it suggests that we are not built on an innate language program in the strong sense that maybe Noam Chomsky argued 30 years ago. In fact, it may be just the opposite, because we've lost some innate control we're capable of doing language. What's interesting is that this has allowed a new kind of variation to show up. And it's allowed, like in the vitamin C case, a synergy to show up, in which lots of structures, in this case brain structures, who did something differently in our recent ancestors, suddenly became recruited to work together. And now there can be selection, in effect, that I'll talk about in a minute, on these new functions. Let me say that one of the things that this points out that should be relevant to all of those of you who are interested in culture and human variety is that we, in fact, have a remarkable variety of cultural systems, as we have a remarkable variety of language systems. We control our reproduction socially in ways that no other species would allow themselves, it seems to me. We control our reproduction symbolically. We make deals about it, and so on and so forth. This is rather weird in the natural world. We have offloaded more than just our ability to speak. And part of what I want to get to next is that if relaxation of selection has played a role in us and shifted control in lots of ways, it's probably not just in this one venue. So let me go back to where I started this discussion and talking about beaver dams And of course, it's not just symbols and language that have been our extended niche, our artificial niche. It's also our tools, our technology, our ways of making a living have also been effectively our beaver dam that have changed us in radical ways. We've adapted to a symbolic niche. And this goes back to some extent to my book, The Symbolic Species. Because although I've just described a lot of features of language that are the result of what I would call a relaxation process in our evolution, probably produced by such things as our social communication and our technologies. In fact, it's much more interesting than that, because once these new synergies show up, they can become under selection. Now, what I showed, in effect, is that the synergies that are responding to the loss of vitamin C production have come under selection in our lineage, so that we've produced a lot of adaptations to eating vitamin C, to liking fruit, to digesting it well, to distributing it around our body, and to protect ourselves against oxidation in other ways besides using ascorbic acid. Well, it turns out that this kind of effect is also, of course, critical in our own evolution. We are not just simpler. We do language in a streamlined way. We acquire it quickly. We acquire probably 5 words every day from the time we're 2.5 to the time we're 5. Remarkable process of acquiring language. So clearly there are specializations. So I want to talk about it in 3 stages now. The first stage over here on the left is this innate stage, the first stage that we begin, in which there is, in effect, only kind of automatic calls like we find in other primates. This communication is modular. It's located in very specific areas. It's highly linked to emotional arousals of specific kind, and we don't have to learn it. We just have to learn when we should or should not do it. And even then, we often can't suppress it. What I want to suggest is, in transition, we move through a phase of relaxed selection. And what this has allowed, like in the Bengalese finch case, is lots of other systems to become involved in vocalization and in communication in various ways. That involves other areas of the brain. But in fact, it's not quite that simple. Because as soon as that synergy begins to show up and begins to be useful, as we begin to use this kind of communication to organize our social processes, to forage, to hold our groups together and so forth, then they come under natural selection. And we develop adaptations now to support the synergy that was produced in this process. And that's what I show here on the far right. One of those processes is, in fact, the expansion of the brain. Why should expansion of the brain be thought of in these terms? Simply expanding the brain means that there's less functional demand on each structure in that brain. It means that it's possible to, in a sense, do 2 things in the same space that only one thing was being done, in effect. That is, it allows more variability, but it also allows, in effect, more flexibility because of this. So I think that in part, this was part of what was actually, in a sense, generated in this way. What I want to say here is also that this is the basis of what I call the co-evolutionary argument. And you heard in the introduction a little bit said about this. This is what my first book was all about, in fact. And that is the idea that this niche we created, this symbolic niche, has played a role in restructuring our brains. Because once this capacity is available, once we begin to use it, we now have to evolve adaptations to do it better and better compared to our colleagues. The key to this story, of course, is that, in effect, in acquiring these capacities, we are responding to something that is not in the natural world. This is not even like the beaver dam, some structure that's produced out there. But this is a structure, so to speak, that doesn't exist in any physical sense. It exists as a way of interacting in a complicated way. And as a result, what I want to suggest, and part of the suggestion I made some decades ago, was that our brains have in part been restructured, you might say, in the image of symbols, in the image of this special kind of communication we do with language. I'm not going to say too much about this part of it, and I'll just sort of send you back to read, if you'd like, old stuff that I've written. But I would argue that one of the problems with the way we communicate is that we don't communicate just with random associations. Sometimes we think of symbols as just simply an arbitrarily correlated sound and something in the world. All kinds of species do that. And in fact, you can put a rat in a Skinner box and get them to respond to a bell by doing something interesting. That's an arbitrary connection. It is not a symbol. By a symbol, I mean the kind of thing that we mean when we talk about the meanings of words. Lexical processes, as they're sometimes called, in which we have a network of relationships between all these meanings. And what the words do is they, in a sense, locate a position in this complicated network of ideas that we have in our heads. We need to build that network, that system, before we can know how to interpret words. Yes, we learn them initially by having them pointed to us and correlating them with something in the world. But very little of what I've said tonight would have been well correlated with anything in the world. And you would not have understood a word I've said, even if maybe it's been a little hard to follow. My point is that what has to be learned in order to acquire something like language is this complex network. We need this network initially. And I like to compare it to encryption or cracking a code. In effect, this is why you can't run into some other country that you've never listened to the language of and know what's going on. Why you can't read the script written on some ancient stone tablet unless you already know something about it. You have to have built up an interpretive capacity that has to do with building up this system of relationships. And without doing so, you're stuck in this lousy situation of having to sort of guess, like you would guess at an encoded message. What you need is not just correlations, but you need to know these relationships. And what I want to argue is that this requires a kind of learning that we find rare in the animal world. I've described this in a number of my works before this, but I want to put it in a simple term right now, and that is insight. What we do when we learn the meaning of words is, in effect, try to guess from what we've heard, how a word is used in a sentence, how a new word shows up. Try to guess at where it fits in the network in those relationships. It usually takes many, many uses, many, many sentences, many, many trials and errors before you get it. Luckily, as we get older and we can read, we have dictionaries we can go to, and we hear these new words. We get somebody to tell us exactly where it should be, and so on. But you can think of a dictionary as a network in which each word is pointing to dozens of other words organized in a particular order. And each of those words shows up in this same system and is pointing to dozens of other words. It's a network of pointers in some complex, troublesome way. We, of course, acquire some tens and tens of thousands of these words during our lives. I believe that we have, as a result, a very different kind of learning. It's a learning bias. And these biases are crucial to our acquiring language. But they are there because the system was shifted, because the way we communicate is quite different from other species. And I won't go into the story that I tell in the symbolic species, but in my early work I have tried to identify what's different about human brains, given the fact that we have homologous structures. That is, there are no absolutely novel structures in our brains. Nevertheless, there are reorganizational effects. They have to do with our ability to speak, to vocalize like I'm doing now, which requires a whole new set of connections, in fact indicated here in red. And also those areas indicated in green here, areas that are involved, prefrontal cortex particularly, involved in holding complex associations and being able to pick up one set of relations in one circumstance and apply it to a totally novel circumstance. This is crucial to doing this work. But in the process of becoming despecialized in one sense and then respecialized in another sense, we now have a bunch of side effects. And I want to end by just sort of describing what I think are the critical side effects of this process. And I'm going to pick out three of them that I think are relevant, particularly to an audience of such diversity as we have here. The first one is memory reorganization. I'm going to argue that the capacity to acquire symbols has reorganized our memory in a way that favors what I'll call narrative thinking and the development of personhood on the basis of self-narratives. The second thing I want to argue is that we have emotional experiences that I think are radically different than we find in other species, even though we have the same substrates in our brain for producing emotions. I think our emotional experiences are unusual. And I think, in part, our ability to empathize, to get inside of each other's heads, are in part a result of this as well. And thirdly, I want to reach way out and talk about this predisposition we seem to have that seems to be so troubling and so powerful and so important in our lives. And that is the spiritual tendency that we have. The tendency we have to look beyond things, to think about the ultimate meaning, to wonder if there is someone controlling the world, if there is a greater truth out there or a meaning to my life. So let me start with the first one, the emergence of narrative. There are two basic kinds of memory. I'm going to give you a very, very quick sort of discussion of the neurology of memory, but it makes perfect sense, and I think you'll find it easy to recognize. We have what we sometimes call procedural and episodic memories, and we find this across species. Procedural memory is a skill memory. When you've learned to type on a typewriter or a computer, or learn to ride a bicycle, or learn to play a musical instrument, it's been procedural memory that's been involved. It requires that you repeat something again and again and again. And with every repetition, you get better at it, more streamlined, and you can think about it less. And you can produce it, in effect, almost unconsciously after you've really, really built up the skill. And it's not just that you can do it unconsciously, but you do it unconsciously with great precision. And we do a lot of things like that. We're very good at this. It turns out that the areas critically involved in this involve what we call the frontal lobes, but particularly these structures deep in the brain called basal ganglia. They are a system that's involved in producing memories that are the result of repetition. Now, think about repetition as people have in terms of memory as something like water rolling down a hill. As water comes down a hill, it begins to erode a particular area where there's perhaps more loose dirt. As it does so, it digs it slightly deeper, making it more likely that water will run down there again. And we often think about this kind of memory particularly as repetitively cutting deeper and deeper channels, making certain connections stronger and stronger and stronger. And structures in the back of the brain, the cerebellum, I don't depict it well here, down in the back and the bottom of the brain, the so-called little brain or hind brain, plays a crucial role in streamlining in that process as well. And so eventually we become very good at this. However, that kind of remembering, repetition learning, won't help you remember what you were doing yesterday at noon. Because what you were doing yesterday at noon, you might have only done once in your life. Or when somebody told you something, like I'm trying to tell you tonight, if you recall this tomorrow, it's not because you've rehearsed it over and over and over again, but because you somehow remembered it, irrespective of the fact that you couldn't have repeated it over and over and over again. How do we do it? How do we remember things that we have only one shot at? In fact, our whole personal history is made up of a lot of these occasions. They almost always require us to consciously work to dredge them up. They don't come up unconsciously very easily unless we're plopped right back in the same situation. These are called episodic memories by some. They involve very different systems in the brain. Much more involved are the sensory systems of the brain, and a structure indicated here in purple down at the bottom called the hippocampus. How do you remember something that you only got one shot at? The answer is connect it with other things. Make lots of connections. When you want to think back about what you had for breakfast yesterday or what you were doing while you were eating, what you do is, of course, you link it up with lots of things. You spend time reconstructing those associations. It's remembered by virtue of creating these links, putting things in an elaborate network that allows you to find your way around by working your way through that network. This is episodic memory. The point I want to make is that when we learn a language, we create skills. we episodically acquire the ability to speak and produce syntactic sentences. We don't have to think very much about how we do it. It comes out automatically, despite the diversity of words that follow words that follow words. But in fact, what are the meanings that we're conveying? The meanings are almost all associated with episodic memory. The point I want to make here is we're using a kind of skill memory to organize and to sample through an episodic memory. Other species don't have this capacity. They do have episodic memories, they do have procedural memories, but what we can do is that we can use the skill at organizing meanings, of organizing symbols, to, in a sense, organize our episodic memories. We can construct elaborate stories about our lives. We can reconstruct our pasts. And we do so by using these two memory systems to play off of each other, to build on each other. And some people have called this a semantic memory. I think it's a little misleading. It's really two separate memory systems that have become unusually coupled because of this capacity. And a lot of our lives, of course, are driven by virtue of this kind of feature, including our narrative self, our purpose for life. We have a goal oftentimes. We want to do things. We want something to mean something before we're done. Our identity. But even beyond that, in some sense, we have a narrative that extends beyond our lives, about where I came from. In fact, I've been talking a lot about where we came from. But we also talk about what's coming up next, after we're gone. We have a narrative that doesn't stop. A second thing I want to talk about, linked to this, has to do with the fact that symbols do something else. Symbols, because they are somehow removed a little bit from the real world. They're stepped back. They're standing in for without having any of those features, or very few of those features, allow us to put things together in ways that are quite novel. And in this figure, what I'm going to try to depict, it's a little bit diagrammatic. At the top, those are meant to be emotions, particular emotional states. And the gray part is basically the symbolic construction, something we've said or done or thought. Down below are what we call blended symbolic conceptions. That is, we can bring things together symbolically that don't tend to show up together in the world. We can uniquely combine things because of the nature of language. And in so doing, we can create sort of novel conceptions of the world, put things together that would not normally occur. But as a result, creatively, we can create novel conceptions of the world, novel ways of thinking about the same old thing. However, at the very bottom, I want to point out that there's something else that happens. Because each of those symbolic components can carry with it an emotional tone, can carry with it a particular emotional baggage that it carries from past experience, perhaps. In bringing together these unique juxtapositions, one of the things that we can do, in effect, is to bring together emotions that might never have otherwise normally come together, shown up together. And they have to, in effect, coexist. I think that this is one way to think about two things that we do that are also quite unusual, and that began my talk with the cat painting. One is humor. In humor, we use the juxtaposition of different ideas that are mutually contradictory in some ways. One of them typically being a little more sensitive and the other one being trivial. And in a sudden switch, bait and switch towards the end, we shift the tense one to the trivial one. And in that process, a tense emotion has to evaporate and a sort of trivial one has to appear. Suddenly, we go from one emotional state to another very rapidly. I think it is one of the wonderful mysteries of human evolution that we have something like jokes and humor, that we can laugh, that we have a unique, emotional, explosive experience when some symbolic twist is shown to us. But similarly, we can bring ideas together that are in conflict, that are in juxtaposition, that never get separated out, and yet have emotional contrasts built into them intensely. And those emotions twist and turn and work on each other complexly. My suggestion is a lot of our aesthetic experience has this feature as well. Again, what I want to suggest is these are emotions that may trivially and very rarely show up in other species. But not only can they show up in us, but we spend a great deal of cultural effort to create these emotional experiences. I like to call them emergent emotional experiences. They're emotional experiences are the result of this complex organization of different emotional systems. Now, I think it also has a place in the brain. Typically, we recognize two very different systems for positive emotions, attractive emotions, repulsive and threatening and aversive emotions. But we also have two sides of the brain. I think that one of the things that happens oftentimes in these experiences is we're allowing the brain to be, in a sense, in a sort of bilaterally dissonant state. And I think this is an interesting area in which I have actually a couple of students doing research trying to actually look at this process in the brain to understand how we produce these unusual emotional experiences. So what I want to suggest is that, in fact, we do live in a world that is not only virtual, built around these symbols, but we live in a world that has unusual emotion as well. As our experience of the world is different at the emotional level, not just at the cognitive level. So at the bottom I list some candidates, the experience of awe, of nostalgia, of righteous indignation, agape, aesthetic appreciation, humor, irony, eureka, inspiration, and so on. I think these are all cases in which we have unusually driven ourselves to play on these emotions. It's an interesting question, why we so covet these experiences, why we like to do it. I'm not going to talk you through this elaborate diagram. I apologize to even show it to you. But I want to move on because I'm out of time and I have only one more thing to say. Luckily, a couple more slides to go with it. One of the things I wanted to say is that this is what I call a transfiguration of the emotional experience of being a human. Along with narrative, the narrative has value in various ways. And narrative itself is an attractive and interesting thing that we find worth producing. We're curious about the truth of things, about the beauty of things, the aesthetic value, and of course good and evil. In fact, what I would argue is that good and evil come into the world with our capacity to think symbolically. It's, in effect, what's in the apple. Let me end with just one final commentary. These cognitive biases have one other thing associated with it. We acquire and use symbols effortlessly. We immediately interpret the world in symbolic terms. When I say a sentence that you've never heard before, uttering weird ideas like these, you have no trouble, hopefully, following some of them. But what I want to argue is that, in effect, this has radically altered not just how we talk and think and experience cultural phenomena, but even how we experience the world. So when somebody describes this in terms of language, elongated shadows at dawn, for example, this linguistic description is incredibly impoverished. It transcribes this experience into something very superficial. But of course, the whole point is for me to see through it, to what's behind it, to try to reconstruct it. Because what's on the surface is just this cheap code. What really matters is what's behind it, what generated it. My whole point is to see through it to the truth, to the meaning, to the ideas, to the emotions. We look through symbols and signs and icons and indices for something hidden behind them. So let me give you two examples. I like to call this the symbolic savant syndrome. Two of my favorite pictures. Now, when you look at these, yes, you see them superficially. Yeah, there's some building-like things over there, and there's a little baby and is that a puppet or is that a person? It's hard to say. But you don't see those. If you're like most self-respecting adults, you're actually looking at these saying, what's the meaning of this? What's behind this? Why these weird juxtapositions? You want to look past the surface. In fact, you're immediately asking, what's being claimed here? What's this about? What's this saying about motherhood? We're looking for the hidden meaning, the meaning hidden behind this. I call this the symbolic savant syndrome, because we have been so pre-programmed, so to speak, to look at things symbolically, to rapidly do this process without thinking, to immediately look beyond the surface, that's the first thing we do. All I submit to you is that dogs or cats or chimpanzees would look at these things and they wouldn't be looking through for the meaning behind them, no matter what you show them. But we do it automatically, immediately. So I want to ask the question, is this the source of what I call the conception of a bilayered world? Every spiritual tradition in the world, whether it's just a magical tradition, whether it's a meditative tradition, whether it's a religion like we have in the Middle East and West, basically pursues the surface as though it's a sign. There's something behind it all, the meaning behind it all. What I want to suggest is this is part of our adaptation, that we are symbolic savants, like the idiot savant that can't help counting the spilled matches thrown on the floor. We can't help looking at things as though they're symbolic, looking for the meaning behind them. And what kind of a meaning is it? Well, is it the dream time? Is it the origins of the world? Is it the intelligence that created things? Well, that's up to who does the looking, of course. The point I want to say is that perhaps the reason that we do this all over the world all the time, even those of us who are steeped in traditions that are empirical and scientific and hard-nosed, is because it's really built into us as a deep predisposition. These are two women in New Guinea who are rolling in the mud. They're doing so because they're co-wives of a man who just died. And he just died, and during the funeral ritual, what has to happen is these women have to coat themselves in mud so that their body odor doesn't attract the ghost of their dead husband. So he follows them back to their hut and brings disease and bad luck with it. So they're rolling in the mud so that his ghost will go to the other side. What I want to say is that we're irresistibly, perseveratively seeking some kind of a hidden logic in the world, the meaning of things, the meaning of my life. It's there behind appearances. It's not the surface, because the surface is only the symbol, only the crude sign of this deeper meaning that's out there. What I want to suggest is that we have this predisposition because we evolved it. Thank you very much.
Actually, we have a gentleman here who has jumped the queue. Let's give you the microphone because these are interesting questions. Please.
Thank you. Well, I just was talking to the speaker about the fact that I photographed beaver dams, and I was just amazed at the complexity of them all. But my question really is this. What accounts for the difference? What accounts for the fact that children learn languages very easily, or languages, and adults don't? But, I mean, you can, as an adult, you can learn a language, but you probably never get rid of the accent, or don't get the accent, let's put it this way. So what's behind that?
Okay, the question, I guess everybody can hear with a microphone, so I won't repeat the question. Why do children do it so well? Why do we do it so poorly? Now, not everybody does it poorly as adults, but most of us do it much better when we're young. There are a number of stories behind this. We don't know the full answer, of course. But there's a wonderful set of studies done purely simulationally, done with the computers, that showed that actually if you damage the memory of in this case it's a neural network computer, you damage the memory a little bit with each cycle, that you get a deeper learning of the structure of language than if you allow it to learn it straight out. This has been also demonstrated with people, in which you simply have people learning a language in which they're getting immediate interaction and getting their questions answered, and learning a language in the context of constant disturbance. It turns out under constant disturbance, adults take a very long time to acquire a second language. Whereas if you're getting it straight out and you're asking questions, you do it pretty fast and you learn it pretty fast. It turns out that after about a year or so, however, what happens is those people that have learned it more directly have a kind of idiosyncratic knowledge of it. It's usually a variant of their own language. They get the syntax wrong. They don't feel natural with it. It takes much longer for those who are acquiring it in a much noisier context, but they turn out to get the depth of it. And one of the findings of this research was that, in effect, one of the problems we have as adults is that we remember things differently. We tend to remember details in ways that young children pass them along and sort of ignore the details and learn sort of the big picture. And what I mentioned the hippocampus here as a case in point. The hippocampus turns out to mature all along up until you're about age 5 in humans. In fact, there's cells being added to that structure continuously during this period of time. And it doesn't really reach its mature state in consolidating episodic memories until between 5 and 7 years of age. And many people have now associated this with something that's sometimes called childhood amnesia. Remember, Sigmund Freud used to think that children don't remember their youth because it was so traumatic, learning potty training and all this stuff and worrying about the sexual relationships with the parents. Now it looks as though it may well be part of the way the memories are consolidated. That in fact, a very different memory system comes into play by the time we're 5 and 7 years of age. Shouldn't surprise us that's the time when we can most easily teach our children to do things like reading, writing, and arithmetic, so to speak. So one of the things I want to say is that children are learning language with a different brain. It's not so much that it's language specialized, but in fact, the way I would put it is just the reverse. I think languages themselves have evolved by social transmission to be more learnable at a younger age, which means that those languages that are hard to learn when you're young are going to be passed on poorly. Those structures are not going to be picked up and passed on very easily. Those that are easy to learn when you're a very young age, when you have this very different memory system at work, are going to be the ones that are most successfully passed on. So the way I would put it is I think that languages have evolved to children's brains. And the reason why children learn them so well is that's what it was designed to do. I saw it there. Yeah, go ahead. I'll repeat it.
So you use the story of the fish to demonstrate it suggests that, so long as finches were being bred by humans, then, their natural song learning structure could disappear. So what would you suggest happened to humans in between the time we were primates and had these stereotypical forms of communication and the period when we emerged with full-blown language? Something must have been protecting us and allowing us to persist as a species in that period when our brains were falling apart and we couldn't communicate.
So again, even though I talk about it as degradation, it's really not loss of generalized function. It's loss of some specific and highly constrained function that I'm talking about here. So it's not everything about us. Although domesticated animals in general have a number of things that have become much more flexible. As you all know, that those of you that have dogs, they're remarkably flexible compared to other species. Now, one of the things I want to say about that is that I think in our evolution there are a number of critical events. And one of them, and I just alluded to it here, was the discovery of stone tools and how to use stone tools to get at a food source that was not available to any other primates and was readily available all over the savannas of Africa. But very quickly upon that, we now know that hominids moved out of Africa, took this one trick, and moved throughout the old world into Central Asia, into Southeast Asia, and walked all the way to Java around the Indian Ocean. Under these circumstances, populations were expanding. There were no competitors in particular to deal with. All you had to do was to maintain this tool technology, and you had a tremendous ability to reproduce and spread all over the world, in effect. This happens between 1.8 and 1.9 million years ago, a long time ago. It is precisely that point at which The structure of the jaw reduces, in which what we call sexual dimorphism reduces way down, this difference in male and female size, and in which the brain starts to enlarge. I think all of those are linked, and I think they have to do with this initial stage of relaxation. But unlike the Finch stage, I think that as one thing is relaxing, another thing is being selected. And that's much more like the vitamin C story. The Finch never has to adapt to anything. The Finch are just domesticated. And presumably, if we let this process go on, the song might really degrade way down, and they might stop singing. Who knows? Well, so the key question can be answered, of course, empirically. We're going to know this question by simply looking at the genome, and that's what we've begun doing. So that's an interesting question that's not resolved yet, and it may well be that all of these features are involved at some level and for some different traits. So at the same time, some things are being relaxed, other things may come under intent selection, and selection for diversity, yes. The question is, how do you deal with selection for diversity? And my way to put it would be that, well, maybe to relax selection would help you with diversity. On the other hand, you lose something in the process, and the question is what you're willing to sacrifice.
I saw a hand up here.
Yes, thank you for a great talk. The sort of outsourcing of vitamin C production to the environment is reminiscent to me of a recent movement in the cognitive science field called situated cognition, or the extended mind theory, the work of Andy Clark and others, in which the idea is that cognition is to some extent offloaded into the environment by humans. That movement, to my knowledge, does not have an explicitly evolutionary story to tell, however, and I was wondering if there is any sense in which you think the kind of adaptive explanation you're providing would be helpful to that group.
It's an interesting question, and you're right, of course, it's happened so fast historically. And history is not evolutionary time, that there's probably very little chance for there to have been any kind of genetic correlate with respect to that. On the other hand, we every day deal with the offloading effect. I don't know how to grow my own grain, how to produce sugar, or any of those things, where to find salt. I'd be in big trouble if suddenly this extended mind disappeared on me. So in one sense, in our everyday life, that is happening. Now, one of the questions one might ask is it possible that in that offloading, we're gaining something else? That is, we can become much more capable of creative thought, of alternative ways of sorting out our problems, or of spending time listening to weirdos like me talk about this stuff, precisely because we've offloaded this demand. And we're continually doing it. The question is, I think, one that's interesting in terms of our future, and that is, will we be a different kind of species simply because we've done that, even historically? Different species just simply because we're living in this totally different world in which we are now, in effect, total parasites.
Let's take someone from the back there.
I'm curious to know if you think that Darwin would be disgusted by something like the Declaration of Independence or Catholic scripture. So when an 18-year-old decides to give their life for this text or to declare a vow of celibacy for the sake of propagating a document, do you think that the human species has sort of degraded to a point where not only are we adapting to this symbolic world that we ourselves have created, but at some level, the symbols are the new game, and they're sort of playing us for their own selective sake?
You're alluding to what's sometimes called mimetic theory. I'm not a great fan of mimetic theory, but we could talk about that in another context. What I would say is I do think that we are incredibly susceptible to symbolic mediation. We are incredibly easily indoctrinated to do things that no other self-respecting species would do. And I think that attests to two things. Number one, how deeply we are committed to the world of symbols and how deeply we're embedded in that world. And second of all, how we have relaxed so much of these innate predispositions that we can be easily manipulated. I think both things are playing a role here, both our adaptation for symbols and the relaxation of a lot of these predispositions that seem to have abated in us somehow. So I do think, in fact, that that's a significant problem, that are we manipulated by symbols? I think another way to put it is we're manipulated by others using symbols.